Connor McDavid's hurt. Matthias Ekholm's hurt. Stuart Skinner's hurt. Leon Draisaitl left the game early tonight against the Sharks. The Oilers are a mash unit. Somehow, they still won against the Sharks. A whole lot to get to on today's very jam-packed edition of Locked on Oilers.
You are Locked on Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's very busy edition, Victory Friday edition of Locked on Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis, coming up on 1 year as the host of Locked on Oilers. I'm very glad I'm still here, and on today's show, we got a whole lot to get to, but first, today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On today's show, we are going to walk through the win against the Sharks on a multi-pronged level of conversation. First, we are going to start with the very straightforward and very frankly important conversation as to what the Oilers' injury situation means in terms of the aggregate, in terms of the big picture. We're going to pivot to how realistic it is if the Oilers can try and work their way through these injuries and then still be serious Stanley Cup contenders. Then in our final segment, we're going to tie a bow on today's show by talking about the idea of result versus potential. So let's start with the aggregate, the big picture. The Oilers won tonight. When all is said and done, 5 years from now, when people are looking at the Oilers record for the 2024-2025 season, they will see a win in the win column for this game against the Sharks tonight. Was it the prettiest thing in the world? No, the Sharks had chances down the backstretch. I would say the Oilers controlled a good chunk of the play. I wouldn't say they dominated, but I would say I felt reasonably okay about the way the Oilers played in this game. They had a solid advantage in terms of scoring chances, in terms of shots on goal, in terms of high danger chances, in terms of expected goals, which is a reasonable foundation. And look, we have talked a whole lot on the show over the last few weeks, the idea of starting to make incremental progress towards a greater goal, towards winning a Stanley Cup. And for the most part, it has been very inconsistent. It has been nail-biter wins like the other night where, as I very poetically did on the show, I covered both my eyes and I held my breath against Vegas and said, I didn't feel really good about that last 5 to 10 minutes, but they found a way. You take that win. When all is said and done, they count how many, not how you pulled them out. But if you're sitting here as an Oiler fan going into your weekend on a Friday morning with 2 weeks to go in the regular season, you want to start to gauge your expectations. You want to start to mentally prepare yourself for what this postseason that's a few weeks away could be. And I think all of us are kind of living in the shadow of what last year was, where they expected to beat the Kings, they expected to beat the Canucks, and it was a coin flip against the Stars. And there might be some people listening to this episode right now or watching this episode over on YouTube who are saying, well, Nick, you thought it was pretty dicey against the Canucks. And I agree with you. It was very dicey against the Canucks. There were multiple overtime games in that series. You won those coin flips. And I didn't plan on talking about this right now, but I was out earlier and I was watching the game for a little bit with one of my friends. We were having a conversation on the aggregate about the big picture of where sports talk is right now. And so much of sports talk is rooted in, if you don't win the championship, it doesn't matter. And I think that disqualifies so much of what makes for a good regular season team, so much of what makes a chunk of players' careers. Like, to tell me to my face Charles Barkley's NBA career doesn't matter because he never won a championship is kind of crazy when he's one of the 30 best players in the history of the sport. And in the hockey perspective, there are plenty of guys who come to mind. We could talk about Henrik Lundqvist, Luongo. We could talk about either of those guys. We could talk about a numerous amount of the forwards across a number of teams. But when I think of the great players in our game who haven't won a championship, Henrik Lundqvist and Roberto Luongo are the first two come to mind. And we sit here, and I don't want to say this Oilers season 2024-2025 is defined by whether or not they win the Stanley Cup, because that doesn't feel realistic, because only one of the 32 teams ultimately come away with the best trophy in sports. And realistically, and I talk about this all the time, it's one of the biggest takeaways. I should go back and be sure whose book it's in, whether it's Ian O'Connor or Michael Lombardi. They both wrote books about the Bill Belichick Patriots. And there's a Belichick quote in there that's attributed to Belichick where he says, when we get off the bus that first week of the season, there are 32 teams in the league. Before we even kick the ball off the tee to start that season, at least 10 have already said, we're not good enough to win the championship. And then you're down to 22. And you would say 6 to 7 of those teams are going to be in the fight to make a playoff spot. And then we get down to the 16, and now we've watered down the football playoffs where a lot of team makes the playoffs. You got 3 wild cards, all of the shenanigans, the bells and whistles to appeal to the television audience. And realistically, of the 14 teams that make the playoffs, maybe 6 can win the whole thing, maybe 6 at the most. And that's kind of where we're at with hockey. We're sitting here right now. It's the first week of April. I think there are 4 or 5 teams in the West that can win the whole thing. I think there are 2 teams in the East that can win the whole thing. And that's what makes this interesting. That is what makes this tantalizing. And we're going to get there as far as the Oilers' perspective of this. But you're listening or watching to today's edition of Locked On Oilers, and you're thinking to yourself, well, if Connor's hurt, if Leon's hurt, if Ekholm's hurt, if Skinner's hurt, what chance do we have? And you're very justified in said concerns. Those are 3 of the team's 6 or 5 best players. And look, as much as people want to bemoan Stuart Skinner's season this year, if the Oilers are going to do anything when we get to May and June, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but if this team's going to do anything, it's going to be because Stuart Skinner goes from slightly below average goalie to above average goalie. And that's not a huge gap. I'm talking about Stuart Skinner going from the 18th or 19th best goalie to the 11th or 12th. That's not a huge jump. That's not an unrealistic expectation or jump for Skinner to have in his performance, in his output over a short period of time. And that's truly the beauty of the hockey playoffs. All it takes is someone to get hot. And sometimes it's a goalie. I mean, it's 2025, and we are still living in the shadow of Jordan Binnington getting hot in the 2019 playoffs. And that's one of the real beauties of hockey is all it takes is one supporting cast. Words are hard. I excuse myself there for tripping over my words. Supporting cast guys occasionally go crazy in the right spot. I mean, it's 2025, and I still think about Ruslan Fedotenko for the Lightning in the 04 Cup against the Flames. It's doable. The Oilers don't need to play out of their mind for that long. They need to get past 1, 2, 3 opponents. You make the Cup final. And if you make the Cup final, I feel reasonably okay about saying it's a 45-55 at absolute worst. We've had some odds where it's a little bit worse than that. The Golden Knights against the Canadiens, but that was extremely extenuating circumstances. Excuse me, not the Golden Knights, the Lightning against the Canadiens. Excuse myself there. Tripped over my words. That was the conference final where it was the Golden Knights against the Canadiens, and the Canadiens prevailed. Occasionally, we get a team in the Cup final that has no business being there. But by and large, If you get to the Stanley Cup final, you deserve to be there. It is very, very infrequent in the NHL we operate in today for a cup final to be resolved in less than 6 games. We are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. When we come back, we are going to tackle why it is a very, very dangerous proposition to keep banking on the hypothetical when it comes to this team. I will see you guys in a second. Be right back. Daylight savings sneaks up on all of us. And if you're feeling that lost hour of sleep, 5-Hour Energy has your back. The extra sunshine means more time for fun, but sometimes you need a little boost to power through. Whether you're staying up late to watch the NHL during this winding stretch run down to the end of the regular season, squeezing in a round of golf after work, or just trying to keep up with your busy workday, 5-Hour Energy gives you that quick, refreshing pick-me-up whenever you need it. I have been staying up late watching hockey, watching basketball, getting ready for the postseason, and 5-Hour Energy helps keep me going the next day. With extra daylight and extra activities, there are longer days, and there is so much more time to take advantage of, whether it's a hike, a run, or a workout at the gym. Tropical Burst is my go-to flavor, and 5-Hour Energy has such an on-the-go convenience. Whether I am at a game trying to cram more information into my brain to be ready for the playoffs, or I'm watching here at home on TV, 5-Hour Energy is the easy grab and go that keeps me feeling refreshed. Head to 5hourenergy.com to find over 15 flavors to choose from, including watermelon, blue raspberry, and peach mango. You can even find your own 12 or 24 pack and get it delivered right to your door. Do you need one right now? Grab a 5-Hour Energy shot at your local grocery or convenience store. They are everywhere. Stock up today and stay energized. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday, Victory Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, as we walk through the Oilers' win against the San Jose Sharks. And I didn't plan on talking about this topic either, but I do think it's very much tied into the grand idea of this episode and this segment. And I was talking about it with one of my friends earlier today. In the last 10 to 15 years, we have had the professionalization of fandom, where it's not enough to just root for your team. It's not enough to know who's on the team, how much money they make, how much term is left on their contract. Now, when you're talking about sports, if you're not talking about how your team goes from where they're presently at to winning the championship, you're behind as a fan. And I was talking about this with my friends in terms of the Yankees, and the baseball Yankees, and we were talking about in terms of how their rotation with Garrett Cole out for the year, Tommy John, it kind of feels like at best they kind of peak out as winning the American League. They probably lose against the Dodgers or whoever wins the National League, because by virtue of winning the National League, which is so much deeper, where you've got the Dodgers, you've got the Mets, you've got the Phillies, you have the Braves. There are so many quality teams in the National League. You would think that if you got there, you would have a really good chance of winning the whole thing. And we can tie this to the Oilers' position now, where I brought this up on yesterday's show, and the everydayers know I've brought this up more than once. The Oilers are banking so much on the idea of what they can be. The Oilers, by and large this year, have banked on the idea that when everyone's healthy, when we have our entire post-trade deadline lineup, and sitting here, I can't authoritatively tell you what Stan Bowman's vision is. I've brought this up more than once, the idea that I would love to have asked Jeff Jackson after the first day of free agency, when he had signed Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson, what he thought the Oilers lineup was going to look like come opening night. Because in a vacuum, let's say they sign Arvidsson, they sign Skinner, and the Blues don't offer sheet Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. Where in this lineup is Dylan Holloway fitting in? Where in this lineup is Philip Broberg fitting in? Do you still go out and do you trade for a Ty Emberson? Do you go out there and would you claim Kasperi Kapanen off of waivers? Would you trade for Vasily Podkolzin back in the summer? If you knew Evander Kane could play before the playoffs, how does that change your calculus? How does this lineup look differently? And it's one of those suppositions where I can't authoritatively tell you. I can try and read the tea leaves. I can try and interpret based on how the Oilers have handled certain positional groups and how they've handled vacancies in their lineup. But sitting here first week of April, it feels like a lot of this lineup is banking on the idea of what they can be. And we talked about this on yesterday's show in the scope of, well, if McDavid comes back from this injury and he's healthy, what does that mean for our lineup if we're adding the best player in hockey on any team back into this group? And I know, again, there are casual fans, there are talking heads who are talking about, well, McDavid's having a down year. He's been disappointing. He is 6th in points. He has only played 67 regular season games, and he is 6th in points coming into today. I haven't looked at the the stat sheet for leaderboards for score for total points since starting recording this episode late on Thursday night into Friday morning. But if a player's down year is top 10 in counting stats, I think the problems with the team are not that guy who's still top 10. Of course. Would you like Connor to be leading the league in points like he has 4 or 5 separate times? Yeah, of course. You would always like your guy to lead the league in points because that means your guys down the lineup are putting up more points and they're contributing more. And ultimately, I think that's really the supposition and the main point of this second segment. The Oilers are banking a lot on everything falling into place. And we don't know what the Leon Draisaitl injury is. And as we sit here, we know he's been dealing with nagging injuries. We know he missed a few games going up into Saturday of last week where they ended up beating the Flames, where he potted 2 and went over 50 for the year. But without Connor, without Leon, without Matthias Ekholm, and yes, if you want to go there without Stuart Skinner, this team is not accomplishing a whole lot. And it's very self-defeating to take that mindset. But this is a team that is fundamentally constructed around its best players doing a ton of work. And I don't think that's being a doomerist. I think it's being realistic. When you look at the Oilers this season and their point totals, Leon has 105. Connor has 90. Evan Bouchard has 60. The next closest 2 guys are 49 and 44. Once you get past that first 5 guys, it's 33, 30, 25, 25, 25, 24. We are talking about such a significant drop off in counting stats. And it's the same thing in time on ice responsibilities. Bouchard is over 23 minutes a game. Ekholm is 22:30. Nurse is 22:16. McDavid is 22:08. Draisaitl is 21:41. Jake Wallman is 21:20. Brett Kulak is 20:08. Zach Hyman's down at 19 minutes. We are talking about a team that is extremely top heavy, and we are talking about the very real possibility of this team's most important players going into the postseason not at 100%. And again, I don't want to be doomerist, but when you build an entire team around our best players are better than your best players, and the Oilers' best players are injured or dealing with nagging injuries, managing nagging injuries, or not at 100%, that presents a real conundrum that I don't think the Oilers have the requisite depth to address. We are going to take one more break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we're going to tie a bow on this show by me making a very strong case for why in spite of everything I've said through the first 19 minutes of this episode, the Oilers can still do this. And that's why you can't tune out just yet. See you guys in a second. The NCAA tournament has reached the Final Four, and FanDuel is giving you on a chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on everything from picking which number one seed is going to cut down the nets. We're talking Florida. We're talking Duke. We're talking Houston. And I'm looking over at my notes here. Florida, Duke, Houston, and Auburn. Excuse me. Bruce Pearl's Auburn. I got to get that right. You guys know I very much enjoy college basketball. I don't know a whole lot about it. But with FanDuel, you can bet on favorites, and favorites have cleaned up this tournament. And with 3 games left, we got 2 Final Four games and the national title game. There is so much time left to get in on the action. And the FanDuel app is simple to use. And whenever you win, you get paid out instantly. There is no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action before it's too late. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Victory Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, walking through what has been a really intensive week. And I talked about this a bit yesterday on the McDavid's being underrated episode, and I want to reiterate it real quick here. The Oilers entered this season as the betting favorite to take home the Stanley Cup. This is a supremely gifted hockey team. The capacity to win the Stanley Cup is on Chris Knobloch's lineup card. There is a permutation of this team that is good enough to win the whole thing. And the next week and change, 2 weeks, won't ultimately have a bearing on how the playoffs go, but it will have a impact on the tenor of our conversation leading up to the playoffs. And of course, the most important thing is the health of this team. And Connor, it hasn't really been established when it's realistic for him to come back. There was a bit of conjecture earlier this week that Trent Frederick might be able to come back by the last game of this upcoming road trip. And is Trent Frederick as important as Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl or Matthias Ekholm? No, of course not. But you want to get him in because he hasn't played hockey in 2 months. And I think that's the most important thing. If I can say nothing else to you, that's going to stick with you going into your weekend to talk with your friends about the Oilers. This team needs to get healthy and really fast. Not so much because I don't think they can turn it on, more so because I think they just need that ramp up period because it's so hard to lock in on command. And I really like what I've seen from some of the supplementary guys over the last week and change. I thought Vasily Podkolzin and Kasperi Kapanen were really good against the Golden Knights the other night. And one game does not make a season, and we've been talking a lot over the last two weeks without Connor and Leon on the lineup. What does that do to your depth guys? And I've really made the case that if you are trying to play your way into this lineup, whether you're Kapanen, Max Jones, Corey Perry, Janmark, Connor Brown, when you're one of those guys on the fringes, knowing that an Evander Kane or a Trent Frederick is going to come into this lineup, and assuming both will come playoff time, there are not enough spots for everyone to stay in this lineup. So it is of the utmost importance that you do everything you can to prove you should stay in this lineup. And Janmark and Connor Brown have inside tracks because of their role on the penalty kill. Corey Perry has a really good track based on his playoff experience and the fact he's like 6th or 7th on the entire team in goals this year, which is kind of crazy. Yeah, Corey Perry's 5th in goals, and he's only playing 1140 per game. That's not the strongest endorsement of this lineup, and that's probably something worth considering if you're Stan Bowman sitting here going into the playoffs thinking about your lineup, that a guy you really only re-signed out of character obligation and the thought that, well, we need some depth, we need some veteran experience, and he can occasionally chip in, and he's been one of their best goal scorers this year. That is a bit of a cause for concern. And as we sit here in this first week of April, it's really hard to find a strong endorsement of this team for anything more than winning maybe a round or two. Now, that's not to say they don't have the capacity to do this. And if you're an Oiler fan, if you're like me, you're trying to find a way to talk yourself into believing this. And we did the optimist case for this team, I think a week and a half ago. It was middle of the week last week. And we talked about the idea that you get Connor and Leon healthy. You get the special teams going. You don't need a whole lot from your even strength depth guys. You don't need a lot from the Connor Browns, the Adam Henriques, even the Ryan Nugent-Hopkins if everything starts working out. You drop a Vander Kane, you drop Trent Frederick, and really quickly you're starting to tell yourself, well, this is one of the best top nines in all of hockey. We play good defense. Our goalie only has to save 23, 24 shots a night. We're not asking a lot of Stuart Skinner when he's healthy, or of Calvin Pickard, who has one of the best records of any backup goalie in the entire NHL. And look, we can be fair. The last week or so, he has not been what he would classify as a traditional backup because he's filling in as an injury replacement. But Pickard still has one of the best records of any backup goalie in the entire NHL. And as we segue towards the weekend, looking ahead, there are still enough games here for the Oilers to start making some headway. And we don't know what the Leon Draisaitl injury is. If you go back and watch the replay of the shift right before he left the ice, it was non-contact. He turned, he pivoted, he grimaced, he went to the bench, he sat there, he hunched over for 10 to 15 seconds, and he went down the tunnel. And you don't want to speculate out of fairness to the player and the team, because it's not responsible as a media person to speculate on an injury because you don't know. You don't want to give misinformation. But we know he's been dealing with nagging injuries throughout the course of the season. We know he had missed a couple of games leading up to last Saturday against the Flames, where he returned to the lineup with a pair of goals. He played against Vegas. He played the first 35, 40 minutes of tonight's game against the Sharks. And as we sit here, there is nothing more important than the health of this team's best players, because the Oilers are a star-laden team. And without the stars, the sky is pretty dark. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. Thank you so much for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, please check out Locked On NHL, covering the biggest stories across the league with the local expertise of Locked On. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. I will see you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.